Now that you have it installed, just click on the app and open it up. You should see something like this, but without the recent file. If this is the first time you're downloading Blender, you wouldn't see any of this. So you just need to click out of here. Now, I would recommend, if you're going to be using Blender, to get a mouse. A mouse is super important when it comes to 3D work. You can also use a trackpad, but then it's not the most efficient way. Trust me, the difference in your efficiency and the speed which you could use to create and move around is a lot different. It's not even comparable. Borrow a mouse from your family, your friend, your enemy. Just find a way to get a mouse. So you use your left click to select stuff. So this is a camera, this is a cube, this is a light. So your left click can easily select stuff. Don't get overwhelmed by all this. You know, if this is your first time here, everything will look super complex. What is going on? What are all these buttons? What are all this? Don't worry about it. We'll get into it. Now, right click is exactly what you know right click for, to show options. So if I click on the cube and I right click, I should see things here like shade, smooth, convert to different things. You don't need to understand what these things mean now. We'll get into it over time. So left click to select, you're already used to that, and right click for options. Now, when you click on your scroll wheel, this middle wheel right here, when you click on it, you know, usually when you're typing and doing normal stuff, you don't get to click on this button. You just use it to scroll. But when you click on it, you'll be able to move the viewport camera around. So let me show you what I mean. So if I click on the scroll wheel and then I drag my mouse around, you'll see I'm able to move around the scene. So if I just click on the scroll wheel and drag my mouse to the left, you see we are rotating to the left, and drag to the right, we are rotating to the right, up and down. Yeah. So this is what you use to move around. And also when you scroll, you can see we are going closer and farther. So you use scroll to zoom in. Over time, you get super used to this and you don't even think about it anymore. Think about when you were learning to ride a bike, learning to drive, learning to swim. It looks complex in the beginning, but then it gets super easy. So your middle scroll wheel is to zoom in and out. You click and drag the middle scroll wheel to rotate around your objects, to move the entire viewport around. You left click to select and right click for options. Cool. Now, if you have a trackpad and you don't have a mouse for now, because I want you to get a mouse, it's compulsory. If you have a trackpad, you can still do these things. You could still left click and right click as usual, but then you have these buttons here. All these buttons here. Now, this is something we call the gizmo. You can see the X, Y, Z, which are basically axis, 3-dimension, remember? 3-dimensional axis, X, Y, and Z. So when you click on this and drag, it replicates what you do with your middle mouse scroll wheel. So if I click here and I drag to the left, you see we are rotating to the left, drag to the right, we are rotating to the right, up and down. Yeah, so this is how you move the entire scene. Remember, this is not to rotate the object. The cube itself is not rotating, but the entire scene, like your entire view, is what is rotating. Cool. Now for this one, you can see it's like a magnifier icon. If I click and drag it down, I'll zoom out. And drag it up, I'll zoom in. So for this, you can't just click on it, you click and drag. So you can zoom in and out. And this hand is to move the view. So when you click on the hand, the entire view moves left to right. So this is different from this. You can see this, we are rotating around the object. And for this, we are sliding the entire view left and right. So remember, when you click your center scroll wheel and you drag, you are going to rotate around your object. But when you hit shift on your keyboard, so if I hit shift on my keyboard and I do the same thing, I'm no longer rotating around the object, I'm now sliding left and right. So that is what this does. So let me just go over the entire thing again. Your left click on your mouse selects, your right click for options, your middle scroll wheel would move you around your object. Click and drag will move you around your object. Then shift plus middle scroll wheel will drag your entire view left and right. So if something is here and you want to bring it over here, if you just use your middle scroll wheel, it doesn't really bring it to the middle. But if you shift, click the middle scroll wheel and drag, it comes to the middle. So yeah, and then finally your scroll zooms in and out. Good. Now this entire space right here is called your 3D viewport. So it's just labeling. It's called the 3D viewport. Basically, where you add all your 3D objects, all the animation that you're going to do, all the modeling is going to happen over here. On the top right, this is called your outliner. If you have used any of Adobe software, Photoshop, Illustrator, all of that. This is more like the layers in Adobe softwares. So it's your outliner. It shows you the objects you have in your scene. So you can see here the collection, and then you see camera, which selects this one. You see cube, and you see light. So you can either select these things here in the 3D viewport, or you can select it here in the outliner. And then down here we have our properties tab. So this is properties. There are a lot of things here, and you should not try to rush into it. You can explore every single one of these settings in your private time, but then you don't need to know every single thing here. That's the thing. Even the most professional Blender users don't know 100% of Blender. You probably use 20% of the entire software in your entire career. Most of it I don't actually use. I use probably 10% of Blender or 20% of Blender. So on this properties tab, we have different tabs here. So there's render, there is output, there is view layer, all those nice looking tabs showing you different options and things you could mess with, things you can change. Finally, if you bring your mouse down here until this changes from an arrow to this, you could click and drag this up. Now this right here is your timeline. So remember, this here is your viewport, this space where you add your 3D stuff, 3D viewport, add your objects, do your modeling. This is your outliner, where you have your list of stuff. This is your properties that has different properties you can mess with, you can change. And this right here is your timeline. So if you have used any editing software before, you know what a timeline is. It's basically showing you time. And here the time is in frames. So this is frame 1 down to frame 250. So if we hit play, here, it's going to go down the timeline. So it's going to start from the beginning and play up until the end for 250 frames. And in case you don't know what a frame is, when you're watching any kind of video, a video is basically a series of images that are played super fast that your brain doesn't even know they are images, and then it blends them together into a video. So if you see a 1 second video of someone jumping, that is multiple images of them jumping that was stitched together into a video. So that's basically what frames are, the individual pictures that you stitch together to make your video. Cool, I hope you're still following at this point. Now let's go through some of these tabs. If you go up here, you can see our layout workspace. So this is where we have been all this while. And this is where I do 90% of the things that I do in here. Then you have modeling, you have sculpting. You could take your time to view some of this, but the ones we use most of the time is layouts and shading. You can just click on it to check it out. And then compositing. So layouts, shading, compositing, geometry nodes, scripting, animation, texture paint, all these ones are beautiful, powerful tools that you might want to explore. But in this course, for these VFX videos we are trying to create, we would not use most of them. And finally, let's talk about interaction mode. So this is your object mode, which basically means you can select your objects, individual objects. You have all your objects in the scene. And then there's something called edit mode, where you can actually make changes to the individual objects. So in the objects mode, you can mostly select each of the objects. So there are different objects here. Let's select the cube, for example. Then when we go into edit mode, come here where you have object mode, click on it, then click on edit mode. You can see there are other options here. There is sculpt mode, vertex paint, weight paint, texture paint, a lot of different modes. But most of the time, 90% of the time, you're going to spend your time in object mode or edit mode. So now that we're in edit mode, you can see something has changed about the cube. Let's go back to object mode. Yeah, you can see our cube just looks like a normal cube. Remember, I'm using my scroll wheel to scroll forward and backward, just scrolling here. And that's what I'm using to zoom in and out. So over time, you just get super used to this that you don't even think about it. So when I go back to edit mode, click here and choose edit mode. You now see our cube is no longer just a cube. Now you can see some points at the edges of the cube. These are called vertices. So when it comes to dimensions, we talked about the third dimension. They are made up of 3 axes, the X, the Y, and the Z. That is 3 dimensions. Now a vertex is basically a point in space. So you can click it with your left click. You can select each of the vertices. Just one vertex, one vertex. Now, that is what vertices are. Vertices are basically points in space. Now, when you have one point here and you have another point here, and you connect both of them, what do you have? You have a line. And now in Blender, the lines are called edges. So this is 1 point and this is 1 point, but in between these 2 points, you have a line, this line in between. So if you come up here, you can see select mode, vertex select. If you come here, you can see select mode, edge select. So this is vertex select. That means you're selecting each point in space. Remember, we're in edit mode. We have left object mode. We're now in edit mode. So it gives us the ability to edit our objects. So this is our cube with different points on it. If we go from here and click this, that is the edge select. We are no longer selecting our vertices. You can see the vertices has disappeared, and now we can select the edges. Remember, the edges are what you get when you connect 2 vertices together. So you can see different edges that make up our cube. And then the third one is a face. So these are basic things that you need to have in mind: a vertex, an edge, and a face. So if we go from here and choose face select, now you can see that each line, so this is one line, this is another line, this is another line, and this is another line. Each line now forms a face. As you can see, you can click on the face now. You can no longer click on the edge since we changed it to face select. So you can click on each face. And you know, for a cube, you have 6 faces. So there is the top face, there is the bottom face, there is 1, 2, 3, 4 on the sides. So that's all the faces you have on a cube. So you can go from face select to edge select, and then now you can select all the edges that make up the cube. I'm just trying to drive this home. And now you can go from edge select to vertex select, and you can select each individual point that makes up the cube. You can see. So that is a basic breakdown of geometry, like a simple geometry. Now let's go to edit mode and go back to object mode. And finally, let's talk about viewport shading. So remember, I said this is our 3D viewport, this entire space. Now, if you come up here, you would see viewport shading, wireframe, this is solid, this is material preview, and this is rendered. So basically, your viewport shading is how do you want Blender to show you the object. Now our object here is a cube. If we click wireframe, just click here, you now see our object as a wireframe, which is basically the edges of the object. You remember we talked about edges, so we can see the individual edges, but we can't select it because we are not in edit mode. Remember, since we're in object mode, but we're in the wireframe viewport shading. So another thing about wireframe is that you can see through the object. So if we go back to here, this is solid. If we go to solid, we can see our object as a solid 3D shape. You can see. Then if we come here, we go back to wireframe. Now we can see our object, and the actual volume of the object is invisible. We can see the edges. Cool. Now the next one is material preview. So this is solid. Remember, everything is gray in solid. There is no colors. Everything is gray by default. Now if we go to material preview, here you can see that now we have a white color for our object, and we can change this color. For example, make sure your object is selected and come down here to material properties. Remember, this is the properties tab, so all the properties we need to change is happening here. So click on material properties, and then you see base color, and you can change the color here. So when you click on this white color, and we can make it blue. So you see, it has become blue. So this is where you mess with the properties of the object. We can make it orange, we can make it green, we can make it pink. Now, if we go back to solid view, you no longer see the colors. As I said, solid view is gray. When we go to material view, we see the actual material that the object has. And finally, we have rendered view. Now, rendered view is the final view, the realistic view. So we are taking account to everything that you have put in the scene, including the lights. Now let's go back to solid view. You can see this light is here, but the light is not affecting the object at all. The light is not affecting it. But if we go to rendered view, we can now see the light is affecting the object. So see the light here, and look at this part of the object is bright, and look at the other side of the object is dark. So I've just added this tool here. You can see you now have a mouse icon here. So when I left click, you should be able to see. When I right click, you should be able to see. And when I'm using my middle mouse, you should also be able to see. And also when I'm typing, you should see what I'm typing, so I don't need to say it out verbally. So this would really help for you to follow along. Now let's talk about the camera view. We've talked about different views, but if you click on this button here, you would see toggle camera view. When you click on it, now you're looking from the direction of the camera. You can see this is the camera, this rectangular view here. And then if I click and drag my middle mouse button, I come out of the camera view. Yeah, so this is the camera view. So you can click this button to go in and out of the camera view. You are looking through the camera now. Then when I press it again, we are no longer looking through the camera. Now let's talk about the basic animation attributes that I talked about earlier on. That's location, rotation, and scale. How do you do that to your object? So in object mode, just like this, you could use this tool, the move tool, to move your objects around, to change the location. So if you have selected this, if you don't have these options here, just hit T on your keyboard to hide or unhide it. So make sure the move one is selected, and now you see this gizmo. This thing is called a gizmo. Wherever you see this red, green, and blue XYZ axis is called a gizmo. This one here is also called a gizmo. So you can see on the X-axis, the best way to remember it is X-axis is left to right, Y-axis is front and back, and Z-axis is up and down. So for the X-axis, if I click on this arrow, you see it highlights the X-axis. The red one is now very shiny. Now I can drag my cube along that axis. And when I release, I will change the location. So drag it and let go of your left click. Drag it, let go. And if I right click instead of left click, it snaps back to where it was. So I'm dragging it. But if I don't release with my left click, but instead I right click, I'll cancel it. Or if I hit escape on my keyboard, I'll cancel it. Same thing for the Y-axis. If I drag this green line, I'm moving my cube along that line, along the Y line. And same for the Z line, I'm moving my cube along that line. So you can see, this is Blender. There are three lines here, the X and the Y and the Z. Now let's go to the rotate tool. This is rotate. Now you have a similar gizmo. It looks different, but then it does exactly the same thing. Now for this one, you can also see the red, green, and blue for X, Y, and Z axis. So when I click on the red one, make sure the red one is highlighted, then left click on it. And now when I drag this around, you can see that I'm rotating the cube, but only along the X axis. Let me undo that. Now for the Y, I can click and drag, and now I'm rotating along the Y axis. And same for the Z, the vertical axis, clicking and drag will rotate along the Z axis. Good. And then finally for scale, you can see our scale tool here. It is very similar to the move tool. Let's click on our object. If I click on the Z, the blue one, and I drag it up, I will be scaling the cube upwards. You can see we are stretching it up and down. Let's undo that. Same for the Y, drag it this way. We are dragging it on the Y. And for this one, we're dragging it on the X. So very similar concept, location, rotation, scale. That is how you change the position, you change the rotation and the size of things over time.